The morning Jennie Walker climbed onto the roof of the Dusty Creek General Store to patch a leak that had been dripping onto the flour barrels since the last rainstorm. Not a single man in town offered to help her, and she did not ask for any. That was how it had always been in the 3 years since Thomas Walker had died. Jennie doing what needed doing, quiet and certain as a woman who had long since made her peace with the weight she carried. She wore a practical gray dress that had been let out at the seams twice, her dark hair pinned back with a copper clip that had belonged to her mother, and her hands were rough in the way that hands become when they have learned every kind of work. She had a coil of rope looped over one shoulder and a bundle of cedar shingles under her arm, and she moved across the slanted roof with the careful confidence of someone who had been doing hard things alone for a very long time. It was Marcus Kendrick who saw her first, or rather who first registered what he was seeing, because half the town had already glanced up and looked away again, the way people do when they have grown accustomed to a sight that ought to have unsettled them. Marcus had ridden into Dusty Creek, Kansas, on the 14th of April, 1883, trailing a brown and white pinto mare named Calliope, and wearing a coat that had seen better days in a state he no longer talked about. He was 31 years old, lean in the way that men get lean when they have been moving for a long time, and eating only when the opportunity presented itself, with dark eyes that had a quality of stillness to them that some people found unnerving and others found reassuring, depending on what they were carrying themselves. He had a face that the sun had worked on thoroughly, cheekbones that sat high and prominent under the weathering, and a jaw that had not been introduced to a razor in about 4 days, which was nothing unusual in April of 1883 along the Kansas frontier. He pulled Calliope to a stop at the edge of Main Street and sat for a moment, taking the town in the way a man does when he is deciding whether to stay or to keep moving. Dusty Creek was not a large town. There was a saloon called the Red Lantern, a church with a bell tower that leaned slightly to the southeast, the general store, a livery stable, a small hotel called Maggie's that had 4 rooms and served breakfast on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a blacksmith, a barber shop, a land office, and a modest schoolhouse at the far end of the main street. There was also a doctor's office above the barber shop, though the doctor, a man named Pritchett, was rumored to be more comfortable with a bottle of whiskey than with a scalpel. Marcus had been looking at the church and calculating the angle of its bell tower lean when movement on the general store roof caught his eye, and he turned and saw Jennie Walker nailing a shingle into place with economical practice strokes of a hammer, her back to the street, the morning sun coming down hard on her shoulders. He watched for a moment. Then he looked around at the street below her, where old Harlan Bates was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the barber shop with a broom, and where 2 men he did not know were conducting some kind of negotiation over the bed of a wagon, and where a girl of about 12 was leading a mule toward the livery, and where nobody was looking at the woman on the roof. He looked back at the woman on the roof. He did not say anything. He dismounted, tied Calliope to the hitching post nearest the general store, and stood there a moment with his hat in his hand, looking up. He thought about calling up to ask if she needed assistance. He thought about going inside and asking someone who she was. He did neither of those things. Instead, he put his hat back on, took Calliope's lead, and walked toward the livery to get the mare settled and watered, because that was the first order of business when you arrived somewhere and intended to stay at least a night. But he looked back once, and he saw the woman on the roof lay her hammer down on the shingles beside her and press both hands flat to the wood and drop her head for just a moment, like something had come over her that she was too proud to let show in any louder way, and then she picked the hammer back up and went on with the work. He turned and kept walking, and he did not say anything for a long time about what he had seen. Inside the livery, a boy named Teddy Marsh, who was 14 and full of the specific eagerness that boys of 14 carry when they have not yet learned to be disappointed, offered to brush Calliope down for 2 cents. Marcus gave him 5 and asked the boy's name, and when Teddy told him, Marcus asked a question that most newly arrived men would not have thought to ask. "Who owns the general store?" Marcus said. "Mrs. Walker," Teddy said. "Jennie Walker, she is the widow. She runs it herself." "She have any family in town?" "No, sir. Her husband Thomas was the one with family here. His brother Ellis used to help some, but Ellis moved his family up to Abilene 2 years past. Mrs. Walker has just herself and the store." Marcus nodded and said nothing more on the subject. He asked about the hotel and whether it served supper, and Teddy told him that Maggie Holt served supper every evening excepting Sundays when she went to her sister's place outside of town, and that the rooms were clean and the beds were better than most he would find in the county. Marcus thanked him, picked up his saddlebag and his rifle, and walked toward Maggie's hotel. He was not a man who made fast decisions about anything. He had learned that particular patience the hard way, in a series of places and situations that had taught him the cost of rushing at things. He had been a cattle drover for 7 years, a deputy marshal for 2, and for the past year and a half he had been something that did not have a clean name, a man drifting along the western edge of the settled frontier, picking up work where he could find it, looking for a place that felt like it wanted to hold him. He had not found that place yet, though he was beginning to suspect he would know it when he saw it. He checked into Maggie's, got a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out onto Main Street, and spent the late morning hours cleaning his rifle and thinking about things in the way that solitary men do, turning them over slowly in the mind without necessarily arriving at conclusions. In the early afternoon, he went into the general store. The smell of it reached him before his eyes adjusted to the dimmer interior, dried herbs and leather and coffee beans, and something sweet that he eventually identified as horehound candy in a glass jar on the counter. The store was well organized. That was the first thing he noticed. The shelves were full but not cluttered, the goods arranged in a logical order that made it clear the person who ran this place had a practical intelligence. There were bolts of fabric on one side, dry goods on another, tools hanging from pegs along the back wall, and a glass case near the counter that held small items of value, a few pieces of simple jewelry, some pocket watches, a folded map. Jennie Walker was behind the counter, making an entry in a ledger book with a pen. She was not tall, but she had the kind of presence that made the space around her feel inhabited. She was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark eyes that were sharp in the way of someone who notices things, and a face that had a quality of composed determination about it that Marcus recognized as the particular expression of a person who has decided not to be defeated by circumstances. She wore that gray dress and the copper clip in her hair, and there was a smudge of cedar resin on her right wrist from the morning's roofing work. She looked up when the bell above the door announced his entry, and she said, "Good afternoon. Can I help you find something?" "I expect I need the usual things," Marcus said. "I just rode in this morning. I am staying at Maggie's for a spell." "I will need coffee, some hardtack, maybe some dried beans if you have them." "I have all of those," she said, and she came out from behind the counter with the ledger still open in her hand, which she set down on the edge of a barrel as she moved to the coffee section. Her manner was efficient without being unfriendly. It was the manner of someone who was comfortable with strangers in the professional capacity of selling them things they needed, but who kept a certain private reserve behind that. "You passing through?" she asked, not looking at him as she measured out a scoop of coffee beans. "I may stay a while," he said. "Depends on whether there is work." "What kind of work do you do?" "Most kinds," he said, which was honest. "I have ranched, done some carpentry, some law work." She glanced at him then. "Law work. Deputy marshal for a time down in New Mexico territory." "What brought you up to Kansas?" "Wind, mostly," he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that made it sound less like a joke than it might have. She wrapped the coffee in brown paper and tied it with string and set it on the counter. "I will need to see some money before I write you on credit," she said. "I do not mean offense, I just have a policy." "No offense taken," he said. "I pay cash." He set several coins on the counter, and she looked at them and calculated without appearing to count them, which suggested she had been doing this long enough that the arithmetic was automatic. She got him the hardtack and the beans and added a small piece of salt pork that he had not asked for but which she apparently judged he needed on the basis of how he looked, and she told him the total, and he paid it, and he picked up his goods. "The roof looked like a solid job," he said from the doorway. She looked up at him. She did not say thank you right away. She considered him for a moment with those sharp, dark eyes, the way you consider something that has surprised you. "It needed doing," she said. "Most things do," he said. He left, and she watched the door settle shut behind him, and then she went back to her ledger and made the entry for the sale, and she did not think about the stranger with the still eyes for the rest of the afternoon, or at least she told herself she did not. Marcus spent 3 days at Maggie's, and in those 3 days he learned the following things about Dusty Creek. The town had been established in 1872 and had grown reasonably steadily, until a dry summer in 1880 had damaged 2 seasons of crops and driven several families off their homesteads and east toward Topeka. The population now sat at something between 140 and 160 souls, depending on whether you counted the 3 families on the far edge of the county who traded in town but rarely came in. There was a cattle operation run by a man named Delbert Crane about 6 miles to the north, and Crane was the closest thing the area had to a powerful man, which meant he was the kind of man who expected his views to carry weight in every conversation, whether the conversation wanted them to or not. The town's mayor was a good-natured man named Harold Ames who ran the land office, and who had the specific quality of leadership that consists primarily of keeping everyone talking long enough that they eventually agree to something without anyone feeling they've lost. He had been mayor for 4 years and was generally liked, though his authority had limits that he himself acknowledged. The preacher at the church was a young man named Brother Callum, who had arrived from Ohio 2 years prior with ideals that the Kansas frontier had not entirely dismantled yet, and who performed his duties with an earnestness that most of the congregation found either endearing or faintly irritating, depending on their own spiritual temperature. And Jennie Walker, Marcus learned from various conversations conducted in the careful sideways manner of gathering information without appearing to gather it, had been Thomas Walker's wife for 6 years before his death. Thomas Walker had been a well-regarded man, a farmer who had also served as a sort of informal town organizer, the person who called meetings, collected funds for repairs, mediated disputes, and generally held together the connective tissue of community life. When Thomas died of a fever in the winter of 1880, the town had lost something central to itself, and what the town had not fully understood until the following spring was that his widow intended to keep every promise he had made. Thomas Walker had promised the town a community well. He had organized the fund, collected most of the contributions, and ordered the materials before he died. Jennie saw the well built in the summer of 1881, managing the project herself, hiring 2 men from the next county to do the digging while she coordinated the stonework and the pump mechanism with a competence that had surprised people who had not been paying attention to what kind of woman she was. Thomas Walker had promised the schoolhouse. He had argued for it at 3 consecutive town meetings, written to the county for funding, and arranged for a teacher to come from Wichita before his death. Jennie corresponded with the county on his behalf, kept the funding in order, supervised the construction, and welcomed the teacher, a young woman named Miss Harding who had stayed 2 years before marrying a farmer and moving to Colorado with a supper she had cooked herself in her rooms above the store. Thomas Walker had promised to repair the church roof, which had been leaking since a hailstorm in 1879. Jennie hired a carpenter. Thomas Walker had promised the new family on the south edge of town, the Correa family, that someone would help them build a proper barn before winter. Jennie organized 3 days of work, and showed up herself with her sleeves rolled. Thomas Walker had promised that as long as he ran the general store, he would extend credit to any family in genuine hardship and not charge interest. Jennie had kept that policy through 3 years in which she could not entirely afford it, absorbing small losses month by month with the quiet determination of someone who does not distinguish between a promise made by a person and a promise made by a marriage. Marcus Kendrick heard most of this from Maggie Holt over breakfast on his 3rd morning in Dusty Creek, because Maggie was a forthright woman of 52 who believed that useful information ought to be shared freely, and who had taken an interest in Marcus. The way some people take an interest in strays they suspect might actually be quite good animals once they are properly settled. "She does not do it for praise," Maggie said, pouring coffee into his cup with the decisive motion of someone who has been pouring coffee for 30 years. "Some folks think she does, but those folks are wrong. She does it because Thomas asked it of her. Or maybe she does it because she cannot figure out how to stop. I'm not sure even she knows which it is anymore." "Does the town help her?" Marcus asked. Maggie gave him a look. "Some of them feel guilty about it and so they avoid thinking about it," she said. "Delbert Crane has offered to buy the store from her 3 times. She has turned him down every time. I think that bothers him more than he lets on." "Why would he want the store?" "Because the store is the center of this town and Delbert Crane likes centers," Maggie said. "He is not a bad man exactly. He is just the kind of man who does not understand that some things are not for selling." Marcus finished his coffee and thanked Maggie for breakfast and went out into the April morning, and he stood for a moment on the boardwalk and looked down Main Street at the general store, where a lamp was already lit in the front window because Jennie Walker opened at 6 and it was 10 past. He walked into the store. She was at the counter with the ledger again, and she looked up and said good morning with the professional pleasantness she extended to customers, and he said good morning back and stood for a moment in a way that communicated he had not come for supplies. "I wanted to ask about work," he said. "I heard you run the store by yourself." "I do," she said. "I'm handy with carpentry," he said, "and most things requiring a back and hands. I noticed the east wall of this building needs some attention along the foundation. There is also a section of fencing along your back lot that is leaning at an angle that will become a problem by summer." She looked at him for a long moment. "You noticed all that from the outside?" "I notice things," he said, simply and without arrogance. She set her pen down. "I cannot afford to hire someone on full wages," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I am not looking for full wages," he said. "I am looking for work and a reason to stay in one place for a while." She studied him with the same quality of careful attention she had turned on him in the doorway when he had mentioned the roof, as if he were a piece of information that needed to be properly understood before she acted on it. "What is your name?" she asked. "Marcus Kendrick." "Where are you from, Mr. Kendrick?" "Missouri originally, most recently from New Mexico Territory." "And before Dusty Creek, where were you going?" It was a perceptive question and he felt it as such. "I was not going anywhere specific," he said. "I was looking." "For what?" He thought about it. "A place that does not feel temporary," he said. Something shifted in her face then, not softening exactly, but a slight change in the quality of her attention, as if this answer had moved him from one category of person into a different one. "All right," she said. "There is no formal arrangement I can offer you, but if you want to see to the foundation and the fence, I will pay what I can. And if there is more work and you are still here and I can still afford it, we can continue from there." "That is fair," he said. "I will tell you right now," she said. "I am not easy to work for. I have opinions about how things ought to be done and I am not shy about sharing them." "I would rather someone tell me what they want than puzzle it out," he said. Something that might almost have been the beginning of a smile crossed her face and disappeared. "All right then, Mr. Kendrick. Come around to the back in an hour and I will show you the fence." He came around in an hour, and she was already there, in an older dress and with her sleeves pushed back, looking at the fence line with her hands on her hips. She showed him the leaning section with the authority of someone who had already assessed exactly what was wrong and what it would take to fix it. And Marcus listened to her and agreed with her assessment and suggested one additional thing, a support brace at the north corner, that she had not considered, and she looked at it and said he was right. And that was the beginning of a working arrangement that suited them both in a way that neither could have predicted but that both, had they been honest with themselves, had needed. He worked on the fence that day and the foundation the following 2 days, and by the end of that week he had also fixed a squeaking hinge on the back door that had apparently been squeaking for 6 months without anyone addressing it, and Jennie had paid him with careful exactitude what she owed him and nothing more, which he respected because it was the kind of payment that came without obligation. The town noticed. Towns always notice these things. By the end of Marcus's first week, various people had formed various opinions, which were communicated through the precise social channels of small-town life. Conversations over back fences, remarks at the barber shop, a comment from old Harlan Bates to Mayor Harold Ames that there was a new man in town doing work for Jennie Walker, and did the mayor know anything about him? Harold Ames, who knew that the condition of Jennie Walker's fence and foundation had been an implicit reproach to the town's conscience for some time, said that a man doing useful work was generally to be welcomed, and let the subject drop. Delbert Crane heard about it on the 4th day and rode into town on the 5th to see for himself. He was a large man, Crane, not tall exactly, but broad in the way of men who have spent their lives doing physical work and have since graduated to directing other people to do it, with a full gray mustache and a way of standing that implied he expected the space he occupied to reorganize itself around his comfort. He came into the store mid-morning on a Friday and bought tobacco he did not need and looked around the store with the appraising eye of a man who considers everything a potential acquisition. "I hear you have hired a hand," he said to Jennie. "I have arranged some work with a man," Jennie said, without looking up from her ledger. "Kendrick, is it? The fellow from New Mexico." "That is right. You know anything about him?" Jennie set her pen down and looked at Crane with the particular quality of directness that had apparently been making Delbert Crane uncomfortable for 3 years. "I know he does good work and asks fair wages," she said. "Is there something I can help you with today, Mr. Crane?" Crane bought his tobacco and left, and Marcus, who had come in from the back with a question about where to find additional nails and had heard this exchange from the doorway between the storeroom and the main floor, did not say anything about it. But later that afternoon, when Jennie came around the back to check his progress on the foundation, he asked, "Is Crane a problem?" She was quiet for a moment, watching him press a new section of stone into place along the base of the wall. "He has offered to buy the store 3 times, she said. "I know," he said. "Maggie told me. Did she tell you why I keep refusing?" "She said you understood that some things are not for selling," he said, repeating Maggie's words. Jennie was quiet again. She sat down on a low stack of lumber that Marcus had set aside from the fence repair, and she looked at the back of the store with an expression that had something old in it, something that had been lived with for a long time. "Thomas built this store," she said. "He and his father before I knew him. His father died the year after I married Thomas, and Thomas ran it, and then Thomas died and I run it. If I sell it to Crane, Crane will run it the way Crane runs things, which is to say with an eye to profit and nothing else, and the families he carries on credit will be cut off, and the promises will all be broken." She paused. "I cannot break them. I know people in this town think it sounds like I am holding on to something that I ought to let go, and maybe they are right about the holding on part, but the promises are not mine to break." Marcus set his trowel down and looked at her. He said nothing for a moment because he was thinking about what she had just said, and he did not want to respond to it carelessly. "I do not think it sounds like you are holding on to something you ought to let go," he said finally. "I think it sounds like you are someone who takes promises seriously." She looked at him. The afternoon light was coming sideways across the back lot, and it caught the copper clip in her hair and lit it briefly gold. "Most people in this town are kind to me," she said, "but there is a difference between kindness and seeing something clearly." "I know," he said. He went back to the stonework, and she sat there a while longer than she had intended to, watching him work with a kind of attention she had not extended to another person in a very long time. The weeks that followed had a quality of ordinary days that were not, in fact, ordinary at all, though neither of them said so. Marcus worked around the store most mornings, fixing things that had been slowly accumulating on a list that Jennie had kept in her head because there was no one to give the list to. He was meticulous and unhurried, which she appreciated in a way she had not expected because she had assumed that a man passing through would do the work quickly and roughly. He did not. He took the time to do things properly, and when he was not sure how something ought to be done, he asked her, because he had quickly learned that her opinion was worth asking. In the afternoons, he sometimes hired himself out to other people in town who had work. The blacksmith occasionally needed a second pair of hands, and one of the homesteaders to the south needed help getting a roof section sorted before the spring rains arrived in earnest. He made himself known to Dusty Creek in the quiet, incremental way of a man who is not trying to make an impression, but simply showing up and being useful. On the third Saturday of his time in Dusty Creek, the town held what Maggie called a social, a gathering in the churchyard that happened approximately once a month when the weather permitted, at which people brought food and gathered around trestle tables and allowed themselves to be in community with one another in an informal way that the formal Sunday service did not quite provide. Brother Callum played a fiddle, which surprised everyone the first time it happened, but had now become a fixture of these events, and occasionally old Harlan Bates, who had once been a reasonably capable guitarist before his fingers stiffened, attempted to accompany him. Jennie Walker came to the social, as she always did, because Thomas had always organized these socials, and she continued to bring food and set up and help with the clearing afterward. She brought a pan of corn bread and a pot of beans that were flavored with dried chilies that she had gotten from a trader passing through from New Mexico, and people made appreciative sounds about the beans, and she accepted the appreciation with the contained pleasure of someone who has been cooking good things for years and has learned not to be surprised by the response. Marcus came to the social because Maggie had told him everyone came to the social, and it would be peculiar if he did not, and because 3 weeks into his stay in Dusty Creek, he had begun to feel, tentatively and without wanting to examine it too carefully, that this might be the place he had been looking for. He arrived after Jennie and found himself standing at the edge of the churchyard with a cup of lemonade. The town women made it with real lemons that came in the shipment from Wichita, and it was, he had to admit, excellent, watching the gathering with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Brother Callum was tuning the fiddle. Harold Ames was talking to 3 men Marcus recognized as local homesteaders. The Correa family, who were Mexican and had come to Kansas following the work and the promise of land, sat together near the far end of the tables, the parents and 3 children. And the father, a man named Rodrigo Correa, nodded to Marcus across the yard, because they had spoken briefly at the blacksmith's, and Marcus had treated him with the simple directness that Rodrigo Correa had learned to value after 3 years of learning, which people in Dusty Creek would look at him honestly, and which would not. Jennie was at one of the trestle tables, talking to a woman Marcus had not met, a Mrs. Fletcher, he would later learn, who was the wife of one of the homesteaders and who was about Jennie's age and who was, he gathered from their manner, a genuine friend. They were talking with the ease of women who have known each other through difficulty, and Jennie was smiling at something Mrs. Fletcher said, a genuine smile that was different from the professional pleasantness she wore in the store, wider and less guarded. Marcus watched her smile without meaning to watch in any particular way, the way you watch something that is pleasant without analyzing the fact of the watching. Brother Callum struck up the fiddle, something lively and clearly well practiced, and the gathering shifted its energy into the informal dancing that always followed the music at these events. Marcus set his lemonade cup down on the edge of a table and thought about things. It was Mrs. Fletcher who solved the problem of the introduction, because she had noticed Marcus earlier and had asked Jennie who the man with the still eyes was, and Jennie had told her, and Mrs. Fletcher had the social initiative of a woman who believes that people who ought to meet each other should be assisted in meeting, and so she steered Jennie across the churchyard in a route that was clearly aimed at Marcus while remaining technically natural-looking. "Mr. Kendrick," Jennie said when they arrived. "This is my friend Clara Fletcher. Clara, this is Marcus Kendrick, who has been doing work at the store." Clara Fletcher had bright eyes, and a quality of cheerful intent that Marcus recognized immediately as the quality of a natural matchmaker. He shook her hand and said he was pleased to meet her, and Clara said she was pleased to meet him, and then said something about needing to check on the corn pudding and disappeared with an efficiency that left very little room for interpretation. Jennie looked after her with an expression of mild exasperation that was clearly fond. "She is not subtle," she said. "No," Marcus agreed. "Are you going to ask me to dance?" She said, and then looked surprised that she had said it, as if the words had moved faster than her intention. He looked at her. There was a quality of openness in the question, a very small opening in the composed reserve she wore like armor, and he was careful with it. "I was thinking about asking," he said. "I was not sure if it was the right moment." "It may not be," she said, "but I find I would rather you asked than that you didn't." So he held out his hand, and she took it, and they moved onto the open grass where 3 other couples were dancing to Brother Callum's fiddle. And it was not graceful exactly. Marcus had not danced in some time, and had always been more competent than elegant at it. And Jennie had her own rhythms that were slightly different from his. But they found each other after a few measures, and it became something better than competent, something that had a warmth to it that neither of them had planned for. He held her at the proper distance. Her hand was calloused in his, which he noticed and which said more about who she was than any number of descriptions could have. She kept her eyes somewhere to the left of his shoulder for the first 2 rounds and then looked directly at him, which he met without looking away. "Why are you really staying in Dusty Creek?" she asked under the noise of the fiddle. "I told you," he said. "I am looking for a place that does not feel temporary. And this place might be that." "Something in this place might be," he said, and he was not looking at the town when he said it. Her expression did something complicated, and then she looked away, but she did not create more distance between them, and when the music changed to a slower tune she stayed. They danced through that 1-2, not talking, just moving, and by the end of it Marcus had decided that 3 weeks was not long enough to say what was building in him, but that it was long enough to know it was building. May arrived with the dramatic quality that Kansas Springs have warm days that turned violent with afternoon storms, lightning on the horizon at dusk, the smell of rain and new grass, and turned earth that is one of the finest smells in the world if you are in a place where you want to be. Marcus had moved from Maggie's hotel into a small room at the back of the livery that Teddy Marsh's father, the livery owner, had made available for a reduced rate in exchange for Marcus helping with morning chores. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was livable, and it meant his money lasted longer, which mattered because the income from Jennie's work was still uncertain, and what he made from the other jobs in town was enough to sustain him, but no more. He was thinking about permanence in a way he had not thought about it in years. He was thinking about it quietly and practically. What it would take to stay somewhere, what it would take to build something. He watched the land around Dusty Creek with the eye of a man who had grown up working land and knew what good soil looked like. And the land around Dusty Creek was good soil if you treated it right. He also watched Jennie Walker with an attention that had grown past professional interest and into something else, something he was aware of with every part of him, even as he kept it carefully contained, because she was a widow who had been carrying an enormous weight for 3 years, and he was a man who had been in town 5 weeks and had no right to presume anything. But he saw things. He saw her come in on a Tuesday morning with her jaw set in the particular way that meant she had been dealing with something difficult before the store opened, and he guessed later that it had been the month-end accounts, because he had learned the rhythm of those and the way they troubled her. He saw her stay an hour past her usual closing time to help a homesteader's wife who had come in on the edge of tears with a sick child, walking her through the medicinal supplies with a patience and warmth that was entirely different from her usual contained efficiency. He saw her stand at the back window of the store for 5 minutes one afternoon, looking at the well that she had built in 1881 and that still served the center of town every day, and he thought he understood what she was looking at. He did not say anything about any of this for a long time. It was a situation involving Delbert Crane that moved things forward, or at least created the pressure that moved them, which was not how Marcus had imagined anything progressing. But life on the frontier was not generally cooperative about offering the right moments at the right times. Crane came into the store on the second Friday of May with a young man who worked for him, a sharp-faced fellow named Walt, who served as Crane's informal enforcer of business matters, and he made his fourth offer to buy the store. He had structured it differently this time, framing it not as a simple purchase, but as a partnership, in which Jennie would retain a stake in the store's operation while Crane provided capital and management. It was a more sophisticated approach, and it was, Marcus recognized when Jennie described it to him afterward, designed to make refusal seem less rational. Jennie refused it, as politely and directly as she had refused the 3 previous offers, and Crane left, and Walt looked at her on his way out with an expression that was meant to communicate something about the cost of continued refusals. And it was that expression, not Crane's offer, not Crane's presence, but that small communication from Walt, that was still in her eyes when Marcus found her at the back of the store an hour later, sitting on that same stack of lumber, looking at the well. He sat down at a safe distance on a barrel and waited, because he had learned that she organized her thoughts before speaking, and that waiting was more useful than prompting. "He's not going to stop," she said. "No," Marcus agreed. "He thinks I will get tired eventually." "He may be right about tired," Marcus said, "but I think he has misread what happens when you are tired." She looked at him. "What does happen?" "From what I have seen," Marcus said, "when you are tired you become more determined, not less. It is one of your more notable qualities." She was quiet. Then she said, "I cannot keep doing this entirely alone." It was the first time she had said that. Not the first time it was true. It had been true for 3 years, but the first time she had said it out loud to another person, and Marcus understood what it cost her to say it, and he did not treat it lightly. "You do not have to," he said. She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was gentler today, overcast with the kind of cloud cover that softens everything, and she looked at him with those sharp, dark eyes that were, in this moment, not sharp at all but something else entirely open, and a little frightened by the openness. "Marcus," she said, "what are you suggesting?" He got off the barrel and crouched down so he was at her eye level, which was a way of making himself less imposing that he did with deliberate intention, because she had been towered over figuratively by circumstances for a long time, and he did not want to add to that in any way. "I am not suggesting anything that you are not ready for," he said, "but I am telling you that I am not going anywhere if that means anything to you." "Why?" she said. "Why are you not going anywhere?" "You said you were looking for a place that did not feel temporary." "I found it," he said. "You found a small town in Kansas that is held together partly by the stubbornness of one woman," she said, and her voice had gone very careful. "I found that," he said, "and I found the woman." She looked at him for a very long time, and he let her look, because he was not in a hurry, and he understood that what he was saying to her was something she needed to take apart and examine carefully before she could respond to it. "I am still married to this town," she said finally, "to his promises. I have not sorted out where I end and they begin." "I know that," he said. "I am not asking you to sort it out by tomorrow. What are you asking?" I am asking if you would let me be here while you do sort it out." She breathed out slowly, something in her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch that he recognized as the specific loosening of someone who has been holding themselves very tightly and has been offered for just a moment permission to ease. "I think," she said, "that I would." It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was a beginning, which was what it needed to be, and Marcus accepted it as such. June in Dusty Creek was green and golden in the specific way of the Kansas plains in early summer, when the grass rolls out to every horizon, and the sky is enormous, and the days are long enough to hold more work and more life than you can fill them with even when you try. Marcus had by now become a fixture of the place in the way that a thing can become a fixture without anyone deciding it has. His tall figure moving around the general store or along the main street was simply part of the landscape, and people had stopped treating him as a newcomer and started treating him as a resident. He and Jennie fell into a pattern that had the warmth of habit and the uncertainty of new territory simultaneously. He worked around the store most mornings. She brought him coffee, which was a small thing and clearly conscious, the way someone brings coffee to a person when they have decided that person is worth the small gestures. They talked about the store, about the town, about nothing in particular with the ease that comes when two people have been together enough to have their own references and shorthand. She told him about Thomas in pieces, not as a warning and not as a shrine-building exercise, but the way you tell a person things that are part of you when you have decided they deserve to understand you. Thomas had been 12 years her senior, a gentle man with a broad laugh and a serious sense of responsibility, and she had loved him with the particular depth of someone who had married young and grown up alongside their partner. His death had left her not only grieving but disoriented, as if the map of her life had been suddenly folded up wrong and nothing lined up the way it was supposed to. "Did you want to leave?" Marcus asked one morning, over coffee at the back table she kept for herself, a small round table with two mismatched chairs that had always implied a second person and had never had one. "Every day for the first year," she said. "And then I stopped wanting to leave and started wanting to finish what he started, and then I stopped being able to tell the difference between those two things." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "It would be easier if I hated him a little for dying and leaving me with it. But I do not hate him. I just miss him, and I am also beginning to understand that missing him and staying in the life we had are not the same thing." "That sounds like a hard thing to understand," Marcus said. "It is the hardest thing I have ever had to do," she said, "and I have patched a roof in April." He laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and she smiled at the sound of it with her whole face, and the morning held that for a moment like it was something worth keeping. The roof became a point of significance that summer in ways Marcus had not planned. He had been making a more thorough assessment of the store's structural needs, and in doing so he found that the roof, while Jennie's patch had been solid, had 3 other sections that were beginning to fail. He brought this to her with a written list, which was a thing he had started doing because he had noticed she responded well to information presented in organized form. She was a ledger person, a person who liked to see things laid out. She looked at the list and said, "This is more than I can currently afford." "I know," he said. "I have a proposal." She looked at him over the paper. "Let me hear it." "There is a cattle drive coming through the county next month," he said. "I know one of the trail bosses from my time in New Mexico. He wrote to me in care of the post office here last week, which tells me he knew where to find me, which also tells me Maggie has been corresponding with someone." He paused. "I can sign on for the last 30 miles of the drive and earn enough to cover the materials for the roof, and then I will fix the roof." "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know I do not have to," he said. She looked at the list again. "You would be gone for how long? 2 weeks at most." She set the paper down and looked out the front window of the store. "I do not like you being gone," she said, and then appeared slightly startled at herself again, which was a thing that happened to her with some regularity when her mouth moved faster than her considered opinion. "I know," he said. "I do not like it either." She looked at him. "Marcus, Yes. When you come back, she said and stopped. Yes, he said. I would like to have a conversation that we have not quite had yet. About what? She pressed her lips together for a moment and then she said, about whether any of this is going to amount to something. He looked at her steadily. It is already amounting to something, he said. But I will be very glad to have that conversation when I am back. He left on a Wednesday morning in late June, and Jennie Walker stood in the doorway of the general store and watched him ride out on Calliope with his bedroll and his rifle, and the same coat that had seen better days. And she felt the specific weight of someone's absence in a way she had not permitted herself to feel in a long time, because she had been very careful for 3 years not to depend on any single presence too much. The 2 weeks were difficult and productive simultaneously. Without Marcus to share the morning work, she felt how much of the physical load he had been carrying, and she felt also, more than she wanted to feel it, the absence of his company at the back table, the absence of someone to talk to while she was doing the accounts, the absence of someone who knew what she meant without her having to build up to it. She also did something she had not done in a while, which was to sit down one evening with Thomas's photograph and look at it with honest eyes. It was a good photograph, taken in Topeka 2 years before he died, and Thomas looked back at her from it with the warm, responsible steadiness that had been his essential quality. She looked at the photograph for a long time, and she thought about the promises, and she thought about Marcus Kendrick, and she thought about the difference between honoring the past and living in it. By the end of the evening, she had reached a place of understanding that felt like solid ground in a way that the previous 3 years had not quite managed. Thomas had asked her to keep his promises because they mattered, because the town mattered, because people mattered. He had not asked her to stop living. He had not asked her to be his memorial. He had asked her to do what was right, and she had done it. And somewhere in the doing she had become a version of herself that was stronger and clearer and more capable than the girl who had married him. And she thought, she was almost sure, that he would have approved of Marcus Kendrick if he had ever had the chance to meet him. She wrote this in her journal, in the careful handwriting she had learned from her mother, and she put the journal away, and she went to sleep with a feeling that was not peace exactly but was the beginning of it. Marcus came back on a Thursday, 3 days later than the 2 weeks he had estimated, because 2 of the days had been lost to a creek crossing that had gone wrong with a dozen head of cattle, and the third had been lost to helping extract a steer from a gully at a cost to his back that he was still feeling when he rode Calliope up Main Street in the early evening light. He was dusty and tired, and he had $42 in his coat pocket, which was more than he had expected, because the trail boss had paid a bonus for the creek situation. Jennie was closing up the store when she heard Calliope's distinctive gait on the street. She came to the front door and opened it and stood in it the same way she had stood in it when he left, except that this time her expression was entirely different, open in a way that she was no longer managing. He got off the horse and came up onto the boardwalk and stopped at a courteous distance and looked at her. He was very dusty, and there was a scrape along his left jaw that was healing badly, and he was standing slightly to the right in the way of a man whose back is complaining. "You are hurt," she said. "Just the back," he said. "Creek crossing." "Come inside," she said. "I have liniment." He went inside, and she sat him down in the back room and found the liniment and applied it with careful hands, and he sat still and did not wince, though she could feel from the tension in his muscles that it cost him something not to. And after she had done the best she could with it, she sat down across from him at the small round table. "You said when you came back," he said. "I know what I said," she replied. "I am back," he said. She looked at him, at his dusty coat and his healing jaw and his still, honest eyes, and something in her that had been very carefully arranged for a very long time rearranged itself into something else, something that was not careful and was not arranged, but was true in the simple, clear way that true things are. "I think," she said, "that Thomas kept his promises because he believed that how you treat the people around you is the measure of who you are." And I have kept his promises for the same reason, and also because for a long time I did not know how to be Jennie Walker separately from being Thomas Walker's wife. But I think I have worked that out." "What did you work out?" Marcus said very quietly. "I'm still going to carry credit for families who need it," she said. "I'm still going to make sure this town has what it needs. Not because Thomas asked me to, because I believe in it. It is mine now, not his, my belief, my choice. And that feels different." "It sounds different," he said. "It sounds like you." She reached across the small table and put her hand over his, which was large and work-worn and still and entirely solid under her fingers. "I am not afraid of this," she said. "I want to say that clearly. I am not afraid of you." "Good," he said. And then, because he was not a man who did things by halves once he had decided, "I want to stay here, not just in this town, here with you, beside you, in whatever form you will have me. I am not asking for anything immediate. I know you have had 3 years of carrying things alone, and you do not need someone to carry things for you." "No," she said, "but I would like to carry them with you," he said, "if you will let me." She looked at their hands on the table. Outside the store, Dusty Creek was doing the things it did at evening, horses being led to the livery, lamps being lit in the windows, the faint smell of supper fires drifting on the warm air. The well that she had built stood in the center of town, and the schoolhouse Brother Callum had rung the bell of that afternoon was quiet now, and the church with its leaning tower was catching the last of the sunset light on its weathered boards. "Yes," she said, "I will let you." He turned his hand over and held hers, and that was the beginning of what came next. What came next was not a sudden thing. It had the quality of something that had been building in correct proportions, and was now moving forward as it should, with the solidity of something real. Marcus hired himself out in July for a longer job. He worked 3 weeks helping to expand Rodrigo Correa's barn, which had grown too small for the Correa family's expanding operation, and Rodrigo paid him fairly, and Marcus discovered in the Correa family something that the frontier had taught him to look for. People who had come to a hard land with dignity intact, and were building something in it that deserved to last. The Correa family had faced particular difficulty in Dusty Creek. There were people in town who viewed them with the specific suspicion that some white settlers carried toward Mexican families in Kansas in this period. And it was a suspicion that expressed itself in small cruelties and the occasional larger one. And Rodrigo Correa had learned to navigate it with a patience and quiet pride that Marcus respected enormously. Jennie had always extended credit to the Correas without commentary, and included them in social occasions with the same natural warmth she extended to everyone. And Marcus knew, without needing to ask, that this was another of her quiet acts of principle that the town sometimes failed to notice properly. He mentioned to Mayor Harold Ames, in the careful sideways manner he had learned was most effective with Harold, that Rodrigo Correa had been doing more for the community than his formal standing in it suggested, and that a man of goodwill might find ways to acknowledge this publicly. And Harold, who was indeed a man of goodwill when someone handed him the framework to act on it, organized a public appreciation of the Correa family's contribution to the community at the July social that moved Rodrigo's wife Elena to tears, which she permitted with great dignity. This was the kind of thing that Marcus did quietly and without taking credit for it, and Jennie noticed it, because she noticed everything he did, and it told her things about him that words could not have told her as well. By August, they were walking out together in the clear way of a woman and a man who have declared themselves to each other, and are allowing the town to see it, which in Dusty Creek was the social equivalent of an announcement. Clara Fletcher expressed her satisfaction with an energy that suggested she was taking at least partial credit for the development, which Jennie allowed because Clara had, in fairness, helped with the churchyard introduction. Maggie Holt said, at breakfast one Tuesday, "Well, it took the two of you long enough." Marcus said that he did not think 5 months was particularly long, and Maggie said that when she was watching it, it had felt considerably longer than that. Delbert Crane made his fifth and final offer to purchase the general store in August, and Jennie refused it with less ceremony than any of the previous refusals, simply saying that it was not for sale and had never been for sale, and she trusted this was now understood. Crane looked at Marcus, who was in the store at the time with his back to the conversation and who did not turn around, and appeared to calculate something, and then he took his leave. He did not make a sixth offer. He was not, at bottom, a man who pressed past the point of clearly diminishing returns, which was one of the things that kept him from being a villain, and made him instead simply a man who had wanted something that was not his. The summer moved into autumn in the way of Kansas autumns, which arrive with a sudden drama of gold and copper, and the smell of cold air coming down from the north before anyone has quite prepared for it. The harvest was better than the previous years, which made the whole county feel better in a fundamental way, because good harvests made everything else more manageable. Marcus had, in August, approached Mayor Harold Ames about the possibility of formalizing some kind of law presence in Dusty Creek, because the town had been operating without any official law enforcement since the previous deputy had moved his family west 18 months ago. And while Dusty Creek was not a violent place, it was not a place entirely without incidents either, and Marcus had the experience to serve in that capacity if the town wanted him. Harold brought it to a town meeting with his usual careful facilitation, and the town agreed, and Marcus was formally appointed as Dusty Creek's town marshal at the beginning of September, which gave him a salary modest but steady, and a proper standing in the community, and a small office next to the land office that he cleaned out and organized with the methodical attention he brought to everything. Jennie, when he told her about the appointment, looked at him with an expression that he had learned to read as her particular combination of happiness and worry. "You will be careful," she said. It was not quite a question. "I am always careful," he said. "You are sometimes careful," she said. "You are also sometimes the person who goes into a creek crossing situation when it has gone wrong." "That was cattle work," he said. "This is different." "They are both you," she said, "and I would prefer you intact." "I will do my best," he said, and the seriousness in his voice told her he understood what she was really saying. On a Saturday evening in late September, Marcus walked Jennie home from the store, which was to say he walked with her the 30 feet from the store's front door to the door of the back rooms she occupied above the stockroom, which was not a long walk but had become a ritual with its own significance. And they stood at the foot of the narrow staircase that led up to her rooms. And he held both her hands in his and looked at her in the particular way he had of looking at her that she had come to understand was him being completely present, not thinking about anything else at all. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "Ask it," she said. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because I think you need me, because you plainly do not. Not because of the store or the promises or any arrangement. Because I am a better version of myself when I am around you, and because I believe we would build something together that is worth building, and because I love you, Jennie Walker, in a way that is entirely specific and clear and is not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long time. The autumn evening was quiet around them, and the lamp at the top of the staircase cast its light down and made a small, warm circle of the world they were standing in. "You said you found what you were looking for," she said. "I did. I think," she said carefully, "that I have also been looking for something, though I did not know I was. I thought I was just keeping promises, but I think I was also waiting for something to happen that was mine, not Thomas's and mine, just mine." "And," he said, "you are mine," she said, as if it were the simplest and most natural thing. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." He did not shout or lift her off her feet, or do any of the theatrical things that romance sometimes calls for, because neither of them was a theatrical person. He brought her hands up and pressed them to his chest and held them there, and she felt his heartbeat under her palms, steady and real, and she leaned her forehead against his shoulder, and they stayed like that in the small, warm lamp circle for a while, which was its own kind of declaration. They were married in December of 1883, in the church with the leaning bell tower, on a morning when the ground was cold and the sky was a hard, clear blue that Kansas does beautifully in winter. Brother Callum conducted the ceremony with an earnestness that was, for once, exactly right for the occasion. The whole town came, Maggie Holt in her good hat, Clara Fletcher crying happy tears from the second row, the Correa family in the third row with Alina in a beautiful embroidered shawl, Harold Ames and his wife in the front on the left, old Harlan Bates in the back with his hat in his hands. Jennie wore a dress of deep blue wool that she and Clara had made together over the previous 6 weeks, and she wore her mother's copper clip in her hair, which Marcus noticed, and which meant something to him that he kept to himself as a private happiness. She walked to the front of the church without assistance, because she was still very much herself, and when she reached Marcus, who was standing in his good coat with his dark eyes steady, and his face carrying the quality of a man who is exactly where he ought to be, she took his hands without any prompting, and they looked at each other through the whole of Brother Callum's ceremony with the directness of two people who do not need to look away. They said the words. Brother Callum pronounced them married. Harlan Bates began to clap, and within a moment the whole church was clapping, which was not entirely traditional. But then Dusty Creek had never been entirely traditional in its enthusiasms. The winter of 1883 and 1884 was a cold one, but the store was warm and well stocked, and Marcus's marshal duties were light during the cold months when most people stayed close to home. They fell into the patterns of shared life with a naturalness that neither took for granted. He was up before her in the mornings, getting the stove going, and she was better at accounts than he was, and he was better at the physical maintenance of the building, and they each knew when the other needed quiet and when they needed conversation, and they disagreed sometimes with the productive honesty of people who respect each other enough not to pretend. Marcus organized a community meeting in February, at which the question of the store's formal continued role as a community institution was addressed openly for the first time. A meeting at which Jennie was present but which Marcus ran, because she had been the one doing the work for 3 years without any formal acknowledgement or support, and he felt it was time the town made some formal commitments of its own, rather than simply accepting her sacrifices. It was a quietly remarkable meeting. Harold Ames proposed a community fund, modest, voluntary, but real, to support the store's credit policy for families in hardship, spreading the responsibility across the community rather than leaving it entirely on Jennie's shoulders. The proposal passed unanimously, and Jennie sat in the back of the meeting room with her hands folded and an expression on her face that was not relief exactly, but was something like it. Walking home from the meeting in the cold, clear night, she said, "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said. "I have been doing it for 3 years." "I know," he said. "That is exactly why." She took his arm, which was something she had taken to doing on the cold evenings because it was practical and because she liked it. "Marcus." "Yes. Thank you." He covered her hand with his, and they walked the rest of the way home in the cold that smelled of winter grass and wood smoke and the specific clean quality of a Kansas night. Spring came again, the second spring of Marcus in Dusty Creek and the first of their marriage, and it brought with it the ordinary miraculous things that springs bring. Crocuses along the south wall of the store, the return of the meadowlarks in the early mornings, the mud and the renewal, and the sense of everything being possible. It also brought a development that neither of them had been expecting in the early part of the year, but which they greeted, when it became certain, with a happiness that had a depth to it particular to people who have already learned what life without fullness feels like. Jennie was going to have a child. She told Marcus on a quiet Tuesday evening, and the way he sat still for a moment after she said it told her that he was feeling something large that he was processing slowly, and then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was something very close to awe. He said Jennie very quietly, and then he came and sat beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him and he held her carefully as if she were something worth being extraordinarily careful with. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Sick in the mornings," she said. "Better by noon, mostly just surprised, happy, a little terrified." "All of those are reasonable," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know." She paused. "I am 30 years old." "I know that," he said. "Women have children at 30. "Of course they do," he said gently. I am acknowledging that I know this is manageable." "It is," he said, "and we will manage it together." She breathed out and settled more fully into his side, which she had noticed she could do completely and without calculation now, without any part of her monitoring the degree of leaning. "Marcus." "Yes. I am very happy," she said. "I did not know I was still going to be able to be very happy. I thought for a while perhaps I had used up the part of me that was capable of it." "You had not," he said simply and with certainty. "No," she agreed. "I had not." The pregnancy moved through summer and into the early autumn with a difficulty that was physical. Jennie was strong, but it was hard work. And the heat of a Kansas summer was not gentle, but with the particular grace that comes of being well supported. Marcus reorganized the store so that she did not need to lift anything heavy, which she accepted with somewhat more grace than she had accepted other kinds of help, perhaps because her body was doing something she could not argue her way past. Clara Fletcher came every morning for an hour to help with the opening of the store, and Alina Correa brought food twice a week, and Maggie Holt had opinions about everything and expressed them freely and was, underneath the opinions, a steady and practical support. Marcus was marshal and carpenter and husband, and generally the person in Jennie's life who made sure things got done without making a production of doing them, which suited both their natures. He also had a conversation with Dr. Pritchett in August that involved a frank assessment of the doctor's current relationship with whiskey, and an offer of continued friendship on the condition of Pritchett showing up in a useful condition when called upon, which Pritchett, to his credit, took seriously. By September, Pritchett's relationship with his bottle had become considerably more manageable, and when Jennie's time came in November, he arrived at 2 in the morning clear-headed and competent, and Marcus sat in the front room of their home. They had moved into a house that spring, a modest 2-room affair that Marcus had expanded over the summer with 2 additional rooms, one of which was now waiting, and listened to the house and did not pace, but sat very still in the way that was his essential mode of being in anything difficult, present and controlled, and deeply frightened in the way that Marcus Kendrick was frightened, which was entirely on the inside with nothing showing. The child was born in the early morning, a boy, with a good set of lungs and a surprising quantity of dark hair, and his father's quality of looking at the world with a kind of still attention that was, in an infant, somewhat startling. Dr. Pritchett said both mother and son were doing well, and Marcus went in and sat beside Jennie, who was exhausted and luminous, and looking at the wrapped bundle in her arms with an expression that was beyond description. And he sat beside her and looked at his son, and something in him that had been unmoored for a very long time, years, the length of a particular kind of wandering, settled permanently and finally into place. "He needs a name," Jennie said. "He does," Marcus agreed. "I was thinking Thomas," she said, and looked at Marcus to see how he received this. He received it with a steadiness that she had expected from him. "After your husband," he said. "After a man who built things that mattered and kept his promises," she said. "Thomas Marcus Walker Kendrick is too many names for one small person, but Thomas Marcus Kendrick seems right to me, if you are willing." Marcus looked at the child, his son, and at the woman who was both steady and open in a way that took everything she had, and he said, "I am willing. I am more than willing." Thomas Marcus Kendrick was brought home to Dusty Creek on a cold morning in November, and the town received him with the particular warmth of a small community receiving the child of 2 people it has come to care about. Clara Fletcher knitted a blanket. Maggie Holt brought enough food to last 2 weeks. Alina Correa brought an embroidered nightgown that made Jennie close her eyes for a moment with the sweetness of it. Teddy Marsh, who was now 17 and deeply impressed by his own capability as an errand runner, made himself available for whatever was needed. Even Delbert Crane sent a note of congratulation, which was brief and slightly formal but was, Jennie said, more than she had expected, and she took it as the small white flag it was. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was a quiet and particular kind of beautiful, the kind of beautiful that comes from being exactly where you are supposed to be with the people you are supposed to be with. Marcus was a father with the same quality of stillness and attention that he brought to everything, which meant that Thomas, from the earliest age, was a child who felt thoroughly seen, which is one of the best things you can give a person in the beginning of their life. Jennie returned to the store in the spring with the adaptations that parenthood requires, and that she made with the practical creativity she brought to all problems. Bringing Thomas with her in the mornings in a basket behind the counter, and nursing him in the back room during the midday quiet, and managing the accounts with Thomas sleeping against her chest in the late afternoons when the light came in gold and warm through the store's front window. She had written, that winter, a full account of all of Thomas Walker's promises and their fulfillment, and she had given it to Harold Ames, not for any official purpose, but because she felt it ought to be recorded somewhere. Harold had read it carefully and then looked at her and said, "Jennie, this town owes you a debt it does not know how to express." She had said that the town had been good to her in the end, that Dusty Creek was her home and her community, and she had not done any of it for debt, and Harold had said that was exactly what made the debt real. In the summer of 1885, Marcus discovered that there was a stretch of good land available for claim about 2 miles southeast of town, belonging to a family who had decided to move north to Nebraska. He and Jennie rode out to look at it together on a Sunday, which was their habit when they had a decision to make, to go and see the thing in person before discussing it. Thomas, who was 7 months old and had strong opinions about horses, was left with Clara Fletcher for the afternoon. The land was everything Marcus had been looking at for months. Good soil, a creek that ran reliably, enough shelter from the northwest wind to make winters manageable. He stood in the middle of it with his hands in his pockets and looked at it, and Jennie stood beside him and looked at it, and they were quiet for a while in the way they had learned to be quiet together, which was not the quiet of two people who have nothing to say, but the quiet of two people who are saying things in a register that does not require words. "You want it," she said. "Yes," he said. "Do you?" She looked at the creek and at the grass and at the sky that went all the way to the edge of everything. "The store needs to stay in town," she said. "Of course," he said, "but we could build here and keep the store. It is not far." 2 miles, he said. "Less than an hour. We could build something," she said. "Not just here. I mean, we could build something. That is what I have been wanting to do since I got off my horse on Main Street and looked up and saw a woman patching a roof by herself," he said. She laughed at that, a real, full laugh that the open land absorbed and gave back. She turned and looked at him, this man who had ridden into Dusty Creek on a spring morning with everything he owned in a saddlebag and a coat that had seen better days, and she thought about how impossible it would have seemed, on the morning she was patching that roof, that anything was going to change, and how completely it had. "We will build something," she said. They filed the claim in August, and Marcus broke ground on the house that autumn when the harvest work was done, and willing hands were available. Rodrigo Correa brought 2 of his sons to help with the framing. Harold Ames came out on weekends with a good attitude and a mediocre facility for carpentry that Marcus directed diplomatically. The Dusty Creek General Store continued under Jennie's management with the addition of a girl named Sarah, who was 17 and quick, and had been recommended by Clara Fletcher, who knew everything about everyone in the county. The house went up slowly and correctly, the way Marcus did everything. By the spring of 1886, it was livable, 2 rooms with a proper hearth and a covered porch that faced the creek. And Jennie stood on that porch in the April light, and breathed the morning air that smelled of new grass and creek water and the wood smoke from their own chimney, and she felt the full weight and gift of where she had arrived. Thomas, who was a year and a half and had recently become ambulatory with the catastrophic enthusiasm of a child who has discovered that movement is possible, proceeded to fall off the porch step directly after this moment of reflection, which was unharmed from the 3-inch descent but very indignant about it. And Jennie picked him up and held him against her hip while he reconsidered his priorities. And she was still laughing when Marcus came out from the house with 2 cups of coffee and found her like that. He looked at her standing on their porch in the morning light with their son on her hip and the creek in the near distance and the Kansas sky going enormous overhead, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and knows it and is not going to take it for granted. He handed her the coffee. She took it. He stood beside her and they looked at the land together. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. "Exactly." The years that followed were the years of a life fully inhabited, which is a different thing from a life simply lived. Jennie ran the general store through the late 1880s with the confidence of someone who has come to entirely own what they do, expanding in small and careful ways, adding a small lending library of books that had been donated by various people, which was a thing she had thought about for years, and which cost her nothing but a shelf and the habit of organization, and which Marcus made the shelf for on a Sunday afternoon, with Thomas sitting on the workbench trying to eat wood shavings. She kept the credit policy for families in hardship, and the community fund that Harold Ames had established continued to support it. And there were 3 families in Dusty Creek who ate through difficult winters in part because Jennie Walker kept her word, or kept her own word now, which had grown from Thomas's word through 3 years of practice into something that was entirely and genuinely hers. Marcus served as Dusty Creek's marshal with a particular quality that the town came to rely on, not the theatrical, weapon-forward style of marshalling that the dime novels celebrated, but the steady, present, community-rooted style of a man who understood that most problems were better solved by conversation than by the alternative, and who had enough physical presence and quiet authority that the alternative was rarely called for. He dealt with a cattle dispute in 1887 with a diplomacy that earned him the respect of both ranchers involved and the bemused admiration of the county sheriff, who had expected the matter to require his office's intervention. He dealt with 2 drifters who made trouble at the Red Lantern in 1886 with a minimum of drama and a maximum of effectiveness, and they moved on and did not return. The Correa family's situation improved over these years in ways that mattered. Their operation grew, their children attended the schoolhouse, and Rodrigo Correa became, slowly and with the dignity that the process required, a recognized part of the community whose opinion at town meetings was sought and considered. This was not unrelated to the specific quality of allyship that both Jennie and Marcus extended consistently and without ceremony, which was the kind that actually makes a difference because it is not dependent on drama or credit. Thomas Kendrick grew into a boy who was his father's stillness and his mother's sharpness simultaneously, a combination that was occasionally alarming in a 4-year-old and would probably be very useful in an adult. He had Marcus's dark eyes and Jennie's way of organizing information into clear categories before acting on it, and he demonstrated, from an early age, a facility with the store's inventory system that Jennie found both impressive and somewhat unnerving, because she had not expected to be out-organized by a person who still needed assistance with buttons. In 1888, Jennie found herself expecting again, and this pregnancy was different from the first in the specific way that second pregnancies are different when you know what you are doing and are not frightened of the unknown quantities. She was easier in herself, steadier, and Marcus was easier too, which she appreciated. The particular quality of his worry in the first pregnancy had been well managed but present, and this time it was present but lighter, the worry of a man who trusts the process, and the people involved more than he did the first time. The second child was born in December of 1888, a girl, with Jennie's dark eyes and a quality of alert attention that suggested she had been taking in information from the first moment. They named her Ada. Thomas, who was 3, inspected his sister with the severity of a person who takes evaluation seriously, and then apparently approved of her, because he brought her one of his carved wooden horses and set it next to her basket, which Marcus observed with an expression that Jennie thought was probably the happiest she had ever seen on him, which was saying something. Ada grew. Thomas grew. The house on the creek had a garden that Jennie had been developing for 3 years, and in the summer it produced tomatoes and beans and herbs, and in the autumn Marcus and Thomas harvested the pumpkins with the ceremony of a serious agricultural undertaking. And in the winter the house was warm and full of the ordinary, extraordinary particulars of a life that is being properly lived. On a Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1889, May, the lilacs blooming along the fence Marcus had built along the kitchen garden, Jennie sat on the porch with Ada sleeping on her lap and Thomas at her feet, building an elaborate structure out of sticks and pine cones that had internal logic she could not entirely follow. And Marcus came around the side of the house from the barn with his sleeves rolled and his hat pushed back. And he stopped when he saw her and leaned against the porch post and looked at her and the children in the late afternoon light. "You look like you are thinking about something," he said. "I am thinking about several things," she said. "I am thinking about the fact that the store needs a new order of calico, and I am thinking about whether Thomas's stick structure is going to fall over in the next 5 minutes, and whether he will be upset when it does, and I am thinking about whether it is too late to plant more beans." And, he said, because he knew her well enough to know there was more. She looked at him, and her expression had the quality of open honesty that she had learned was safe with him, that would never be taken for anything but what it was. "I am thinking that I am very happy," she said. "I am thinking that I spent a long time not knowing that this was still possible, and then you came along and stood on the street below my store and watched me patch a roof and did not say anything about it for weeks, and now here we are." "Here we are," he agreed, and there was everything in his voice, the Missouri childhood and the years of drifting and the morning he had ridden into Dusty Creek and seen something on a roof that he could not look away from, and it settled around them as solid as the land they were standing on. Thomas's stick structure collapsed with a soft avalanche of small sounds. Thomas regarded it for a moment, then began reconstructing it with the philosophical pragmatism of someone who has not yet learned to be discouraged by the collapse of things, which was perhaps the most useful thing a childhood could teach a person. Marcus came up onto the porch and sat beside Jennie, and Ada made a small sound in her sleep and settled again, and the creek made its creak sounds in the near distance, and Dusty Creek was going about its business 2 miles to the northwest in the ordinary important way that small towns go about their business. And the store was there, and the well was there, and the schoolhouse was there, and all the things that Thomas Walker had promised and Jennie Walker had built were there, still standing, still serving, still full of the human weight of their purpose. Jennie leaned her head against Marcus's shoulder, which she did the way she did everything, with certainty, without reservation, as a clear and chosen thing. "The beans," she said. "We will plant them tomorrow," he said. "The calico order. I will take the wagon in Tuesday. Thomas's structure is going to fall over again." "Almost certainly." "Good," she said. "He needs to learn to rebuild things." "He already knows how," Marcus said, watching their son sort through the pine cones with methodical focus. "He just likes the practice." She lifted her head and looked at him, her husband, her partner, the man who had ridden into her town on a spring morning and seen her clearly from the very first moment, and had waited and been present, and had never once tried to carry things for her without being invited to carry them with her. And she thought that love, when it came in the right form, was not a diminishment of anything you had been before. It was what you were made fuller. "Marcus," she said. "Yes." "I love you," she said, plainly and completely, in the way she said everything now. He looked at her with those still dark eyes that had been looking at her honestly since the first Tuesday she had sold him coffee beans and hardtack and salt pork she had added because he looked like he needed it. And he said, "I love you, Jennie," in the voice of a man who has been keeping that true for long enough that it is simply how things are settled and certain and permanent, like the well at the center of town, like the house on the creek. Like the promises that had been kept through grief and stubbornness and love until they became something larger than any one person could have made them alone. Thomas finished rebuilding his structure. Ada slept. The lilacs moved in the light spring wind. The land rolled out in every direction as it always had and always would, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to everything, except whether the people on it intended to stay and build and mean it. They intended to, and they did.